Shalom. Um, Today we're going to look at some of the teachings of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. I'm very excited to be looking into this. And kind of, I've been quoting Rebbe Nachman throughout all these shiurim, but this is maybe the first time that I'm dedicating a whole shiur to exploring one of his teachings. And obviously I keep coming back to Rebbe Nachman because he's so deliciously complex, and there's always like something to connect to in everything he says, and for everything I think about, there's always something he said that connects to it. Um, and this teaching, Torah Ein Chet, teaching 78 in the collection of his works, is a little bit famous. So I always say famous if I've heard of it. um, but it's written just a few months before his death, and in a time of very like a very difficult time for him. And just before I get into it, I want to read the backstory, right? The story about the teaching of this teaching, written by his student, Rebbe Natan. And he writes this: there's a lot to say about the way this teaching was given to us. It's impossible to set this down in writing, but I will try to describe it nonetheless. This teaching was given in Uman on the Shabbat after Tisha B'Av 1810, just before he departed from this world. On this Shabbat, he was isolated in his room, and many followers came to see him, both new disciples and old, to be with him on the Holy Shabbat. He was then very weak, and he hardly had the strength to speak, and after Kiddush he sat down at the table and could not even return to his room. He was extremely weak and began to speak with fatigue. "Why do you travel to see me? I do not know anything at all. If I had some Torah to teach, you could have traveled to see me. But why did you come now? I really just don't know anything. I'm really just a prostic, a simpleton." He repeated this 2 or 3 times, how simple he was. And then he teaches the teaching that we'll look at in a minute. But then there's this description. After he taught all that he taught, he was overcome by happiness and told us to start singing Azamer Bishvachin, and he sang with us. He started talking about many things with joy and with wonder and awe-inspiring feeling, and he spent the dinner giving us words of encouragement. Only a small amount of this was ever printed. Then he cried from the depth of his heart, "Ah, Gewalt!" And he used these words, "Kein Jeush ist gar nicht vorhanden." There's no despair in the world at all. No despair exists. It's impossible to describe the mysteries that he hinted at with his holy movements and his infinite encouragement. Okay, that's the story, that's the description, and I brought that. It's interesting for me because it talks about encouragement, but it seems like it actually worked for him, right? All these people come to listen to him teach, and he says, "I have nothing. I'm empty. I'm empty of. There's nothing in me to teach you. Uh, I'm only alive because of something." And he starts explaining why he's still alive, and through this explanation of why he's alive, he teaches this wonderful thing, and that brings him to life. Brings him back to this connection that he had, that he's describing. So it's an embodiment of the teaching. That's why I like this description. I'll go through the teaching a little bit. It doesn't really do this justice, and if you want, go into the text itself and read it. He starts by saying, at times the true tzaddik, the true righteous person, is a genuinely ordinary person, called in Slavic languages prostic, simpleton. He lives the life of simplicity. He does not reveal any Torah teachings, but engages in everyday conversations. He's just a normal, everyday person. And then he starts wondering, how can this be? Torah is life. And this connection he knows from the Torah is vitality, it brings him to life. Anyone who separates from the Torah is as if separating from life. That's like he knows these moments of spiritual connection, which he calls here Torah, and he knows that brings him life. But then he starts asking, how can it be that people are still alive even when they're not engaging in Torah? When, for example, they go to sleep, or go to the toilet, or they're ill, right? Remember, he's very sick when he's writing this. He's coughing blood. So on one hand, like, he knows that he has to, he needs to, he wants to connect to this Torah, to this spiritual connection. And on the other hand, life gets in the way of life. How can it be? So he's stuck in this dilemma. And he acknowledges, yeah, there's people, first of all, there's people who have to stop studying Torah sometimes because of their body, because of work, because of all sorts of things that get in the way. But also, there's people who've never studied Torah. There's people, like he's sitting in Oman playing chess with people who've never studied Torah. How can it be that they're alive? Right? He's stuck with this dilemma. But then he says, yeah, actually, when people are removed from this spiritual connection, from the Torah, there's another way of being alive. Right? He calls it the journey to the land of Israel. And it's true, he actually did do a journey to the land of Israel, which is an amazing story in itself. But here he's talking about something, he's taking it more conceptually, the journey to the land of Israel. What does that mean? Okay, how can it be that everyone, all sorts of people, even non-Jews, right, people who never heard of the Torah, how can it be that they're alive from the journey to the land of Israel? What does that mean? Okay, he says, look, there's this thing we call Torah, and that Torah, say, the Torah was given Mount Sinai at some point in history, but the world existed before that, right? There's a world before the Torah. There's all these people who had this life before they had Torah, before they had the system. How can it be? Because before the Torah, the world existed because of kindness. And you can imagine the Torah is a system which has rules and so on, and if you follow the rules, then you deserve connection, you deserve a spiritual connection. But before the Torah, you still have a spiritual connection, but you don't deserve it. It's just kindness. Right? Olam chesed yibaneh. The world was built on kindness. And he talks about 26 generations that lived before the Torah was given. And he makes this parallel between the 10 Commandments, like the rules, and the 10 sayings. Right? The world was created through 10 acts of speech. When God says, let there be light, let there be sun and the moon, let there be grass. All those acts of let there be, according to tradition, there were 10 of those. And that's the parallel to the 10 Commandments. Right? There's a Torah which is embodied in every act of creation, which is different to the kind of the fixed Torah, which is in the 10 Commandments. And that's the way that you can still access life even without studying Torah. And how can you access life? Just anything in creation, right? If you can't study Torah because you're in a crowded train, there's Torah in the crowded train because that's part of creation. If you're with a screaming baby, if you're with a headache, if you're working in the supermarket, like all these things which you think are removing you from Torah, they're part of creation too. So there's a path through them to get to God, and there's a kindness in knowing that, and that's what he calls derech eretz, right? Derech eretz. It it means a kind of just being a normal person, being a good person, politeness, civil civil discourse, just being good, a mensch, being good, and literally it means derech, like a journey to the land. That's what he says, the journey to the land of Israel. That journey that we're on, just being a normal person, struggling to be a normal person. There's Torah and derech eretz, and derech eretz kadma Torah. This act of this way of living and just an ordinary life, that comes before Torah, and in a way is more basic than Torah itself. And it doesn't give a magic answer. How do you find connection in everything, right? But just knowing that it's possible is encouraging. And that's where he gets this scream of kein Yeush is gar nicht vorhanden. There's no such thing as despair. If we want to expand this from like Torah books, in a religious framework, think about all sorts of things. Think about I don't know. Think about love at a wedding ceremony, right? It's very obvious that there's love there, and you have all the ceremony, everything. That's like the Torah. That's the framework and the system. Yeah, so that's kind of that's easy. When you're removed from that, and you just have every day, and sometimes you fall from that, and sometimes you're a very simple person, right? Just quickly rushing breakfast together before going off to work. That's the fault of the simpleness, but that simpleness that came before the system, there you can see, there's a kind of love that doesn't depend on the system there. You can say, there's wow, it's amazing. I'm having breakfast with my lover, and from that fall from the heights of being in this very obvious love to not being in an obvious place, that allows you to reconnect in a different way, right? You can think of all sorts of systems of creativity. I don't know, if you're in art school and that's the system, and sometimes you're trying to earn a living and you forget you're an artist, right? So there you have to reconnect at that point and find it in the simplicity and come back to the Torah. There's Torah in everything. There's Torah in every creation. And we shouldn't be discouraged. So, good luck.